The air in the kitchen was sharp and clean, like the edge of a perfectly honed knife. It tasted of bleach and fresh parsley. Every surface, from the gleaming stainless steel counters to the white tile walls, was polished to a mirror finish. There were no fingerprints. There were no crumbs. This was not just a kitchen. It was a sanctuary of control, a laboratory where art was born under the watchful eye of its high priest. Chef Julian Vance. Julian moved through his domain like a predator. He was 35, but carried the weary authority of a man twice his age, a weight he put on himself every single morning. His chef's whites were immaculate, his dark hair slicked back with precision, not a strand out of place. He didn't walk so much as glide, his soft-soled shoes making no sound on the anti-fatigue mats, which made his sudden appearances all the more terrifying. The kitchen staff, a team of young and hungry cooks, moved with a tense, choreographed energy. They communicated in whispers and sharp, clipped hand signals, a language born of necessity in Julian's world. A dropped spoon was a catastrophe. A misplaced ingredient was a sign of disrespect. He stopped by the sauce station. A young cook with a nervous tremor in his hands was reducing a balsamic glaze, swirling the copper pot with intense concentration. Julian stood behind him, silent. The cook felt the shadow fall over him, and his shoulders tightened. He could feel Julian's breath on his neck. "The viscosity is off," Julian said, his voice a low, quiet rumble that was more intimidating than any shout. "It's too thin. It looks like water. It won't cling to the scallop." "Sorry, chef," the cook stammered. "It just needs another 30 seconds. "No," Julian countered, not raising his voice. "It's ruined. You applied too much heat too early. You panicked. This sauce is now worthless. Start again, and use a smaller pot this time. You have no control over the evaporation." Without another word, Julian took the pot, the contents steaming, and poured it down the drain. The sound of the liquid gurgling into the sink was the only sound for a moment. The cook didn't dare look up, just reached for a fresh pot and a new bottle of aged balsamic. His face burned with shame. This was how Julian taught. Not with guidance, but with punishment. It was brutal, but it produced results. His restaurant, Verve, had a Michelin star and a waiting list 3 months long. Critics wrote poems about his genius and his bravery. They didn't see the quiet tyranny it took to produce a single plate of food. Julian moved on, his gaze sweeping over the line. He saw a cook plating a seared tuna dish. He stepped forward, picked up a pair of tweezers, and with surgical precision, moved a single microgreen leaf 3 millimeters to the left. The cook held his breath. Julian nodded once, a tiny, almost imperceptible gesture of approval, and moved on. The cook let out a shaky breath, feeling like he had just survived a lightning strike. This was Julian's reality. He had built this world, brick by sterile brick. He had sacrificed everything for it: friendships, relationships, sleep. Food was all that mattered. Not just eating it, but conquering it. He believed the old ways were for old people, sentimental fools who clung to butter and cream and tradition. His food was intellectual. It was about deconstruction and innovation, about surprising the palate, about showing them something they had never seen before. He once served a deconstructed clam chowder that was a clear broth, single perfectly poached clam, a foam of potato essence, and a powder of dehydrated bacon. It was technically brilliant. It was also cold. But the critics loved it, and that's what mattered. Out in the dining room, the atmosphere was different. It was the quiet hum of money and status. The room was filled with men in sharp suits and women in elegant dresses. The clinking of expensive wine glasses and the soft, confidential tones of people who were used to being heard. They were here to see and be seen, to eat the food they could brag about later. They treated Julian's creations less like a meal and more like a cultural experience. Something to be photographed and posted online before the first bite was even taken. But in a quiet corner, a booth tucked away from the main flow, sat a woman who didn't seem to belong. She was perhaps in her early 70s, with silver hair pulled back in a simple, elegant chignon. Her face was a gentle map of a life well lived, her eyes clear and observant. She wore a simple dark blue cardigan over a crisp white shirt. She had no jewelry save for a small, plain watch on her wrist. With her was a young man, maybe 20, her grandson, who was explaining the architecture of the building with enthusiastic gestures. She listened with a soft smile, but her attention kept drifting to the room. She watched the other diners, the way they held their forks, the way they posed with their food. She was an anthropologist studying a foreign tribe. When their food arrived, the young man snapped a few photos with his phone. The grandmother simply waited patiently. Her appetizer was what Julian called a garden of the sea, a collection of raw seafood arranged on a bed of black salt with geometric dots of various sauces and gels. It looked like a piece of modern art. She took a small bite of a piece of sea bass that had been lightly cured in citrus. She chewed slowly, her eyes closing for just a second. There was a flash of something on her face, not disappointment, but a thoughtful curiosity. It was the look of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Her grandson, meanwhile, had already devoured half his plate, his focus back on his phone. She took another bite, a single oyster with a foam of green apple on top. She swallowed, took a sip of water, and then leaned toward her grandson. "It's very clever," she said, her voice soft but clear. "He uses acid to trick your mouth into thinking the fish is cooked." "A brilliant technique, I know, right?" the young man said, looking up. "It's amazing. But it's missing the soul of the sea," she continued, almost to herself. "The salt is just for show. It tastes like a kitchen, not like an ocean." She didn't say it with malice, but with the quiet certainty of someone who simply knew better. She wasn't complaining. She was observing. She was a musician listening to a technically perfect but emotionless performance. She finished her plate, not with relish, but with a sense of duty, as if she had needed to study it. Back in the kitchen, Julian had finished his final pass. The service was running like a Swiss watch. He felt the familiar thrum of victory in his veins. Everything was perfect. He decided to make a rare appearance in the dining room, to let his subjects see their king. He wanted to see the faces of the people he was impressing, to soak in their admiration. He walked through the room, his posture straight, a practiced, humble smile on his face. He stopped at tables, shaking hands, accepting compliments. He was charming, confident, the very picture of a successful chef. He was enjoying the adoration, the confirmation that his vision was the right one. Then his eyes scanned the room and fell upon the quiet booth in the corner. He saw the young man engrossed in his phone, but then he saw the older woman. She wasn't looking at him. She wasn't looking at the other people. She was looking down at her empty appetizer plate with a look of quiet, serious contemplation. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't taking a picture. She looked like she was in a deep conversation with the ghost of the food she had just eaten. It was a look of critique. Julian's smile tightened. In his perfect, beautiful world, where everyone adored him, this one face was an imperfection, a silent, disapproving anomaly. It was a tiny crack in the gleaming facade of his temple. And he, Julian Vance, the man who could not tolerate a single misplaced leaf on a plate, certainly could not tolerate this. He felt a prickle of irritation under his skin. He began to walk toward her table, his soft-soled shoes making no sound on the thick carpet. He needed to know what she was thinking, and he was going to make her regret it. The journey from the center of the dining room to the quiet corner booth was the longest 10 yards Julian had ever walked. Each step felt heavy, purposeful. The practiced, humble smile for his adoring customers melted away, replaced by the hard, focused expression he wore in his kitchen. He was no longer a charming host. He was a surgeon approaching a problem. He saw her grandson look up, his eyes widening slightly as he recognized the famous chef approaching their table. The young man quickly tucked his phone away, a flicker of excitement and nervousness on his face. The older woman, however, didn't look up until Julian's shadow fell across their table. She felt the change in the light and raised her eyes slowly. Her gaze was calm, unimpressed. It wasn't hostile or challenging. It was simply knowing. It was the look of a master craftswoman examining a novice's work, seeing the flaws, the potential, and the impatience all at once. This look, more than any shouted insult, unsettled Julian. He was used to people looking at him with awe, with desire, with envy. This calm, patient assessment was something new, and it infuriated him. "Madame," he began, his voice smooth but with an edge of steel just beneath the surface, "I hope you are enjoying your meal." It wasn't a question. It was a command to enjoy it. "It is a very interesting experience, chef," she replied. Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight that made him lean in slightly to hear her over the dining room's hum. "You have a very talented hand. It's interesting. Talented, not delicious. Not wonderful. Interesting." To Julian, these were the words people used when they didn't know what else to say. When they were afraid to say they didn't like it. "I'm glad to hear it," he said, though he was anything but. "I couldn't help but notice you studying your plate with such intensity. As a chef, I'm always fascinated to see how our guests connect with the food." He was lying, of course. He wasn't fascinated. He was offended. He wanted to expose her as a pretender, civilian who was out of her depth in a place like Verve. A small, polite smile touched the woman's lips. "My grandson was explaining your techniques. It is impressive what you can do with food." She paused, then looked him directly in the eye. "I was just thinking that sometimes in the search for something new, we forget the things that are old for a reason. The heart of a dish, for example, is not something that can be created with foam or a chemical. It has to be built over a slow fire, with patience." Her grandson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, shooting Julian an apologetic look. But Julian didn't see him. He was locked in a battle of wills with this soft-spoken woman. Her words struck him like tiny, precise needles. He heard the unspoken criticism loud and clear. His food was technically brilliant, but soulless. It was a charge he had secretly feared for years, a fear he buried under layers of arrogance and Michelin stars. "And what, might I ask, makes you an expert on the heart of a dish, madame?" he asked. The politeness was gone now, replaced by a cold, cutting condescension. He could feel the tables around them go quiet. The other diners were sensing the drama. The woman didn't flinch. "I have spent a great many years around kitchens, chef. Long enough to know the difference between a meal and a performance." It was the final straw. The word performance. She had called his life's work a cheap trick. The anger, which had been simmering, now boiled over. But he knew how to handle this. He wouldn't yell. That would be crude. He would use his own weapon, his kitchen, his arena, to dismantle her completely. "You have a very strong opinion for someone who has only eaten one course," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous purr. "It is very easy to be a critic. It is much harder to be a creator, to stand in the heat and make something from nothing." He leaned in closer, his voice for her and her grandson alone. "I have a proposition for you, madame. A little challenge. You seem to believe that you understand food on a level my entire kitchen staff does not. I am willing to give you a chance to prove it." The grandson's mouth fell open. "Grandmother." "No," he started, but she held up a hand to silence him. Her eyes never left Julian's face. "I will let you into my kitchen," Julian continued, savoring the power he now held. "You can use my ingredients, my equipment. You will cook for me." He paused, letting the audacity of the offer hang in the air. He could see the surprise and horror on the faces of the waitstaff, who were pretending not to listen. "Of course," he added with a cruel smirk, "we must choose a dish that truly tests skill. Not one of my little modern paintings. We need a classic, something with history, something that requires real technique, not just a few fancy tools. How about canard à la presse?" The name hung between them. Pressed duck. It was a monster of a dish, a relic from a bygone era of French grand cuisine. It was brutally difficult. It required a whole duck to be served in 2 parts. The breast was roasted and sliced, while the remaining carcass was put into a heavy silver press to crush out the bones and blood, which were then mixed with cognac and sauce to create a rich, dark, and intensely flavored gravy. It was a dish that required strength, precision, and an almost religious understanding of flavor. No one made it anymore. It was theatrical, bloody, and completely out of place in a modern, minimalist kitchen like Verve. It was the perfect weapon. Julian knew it was impossible. He didn't even have a silver press. He would have to send a runner to a culinary antique shop across town. The challenge was a setup, A public humiliation designed to make her back down, to apologize for her insolence. "I doubt your kitchen even has a press," she said, her voice still steady. She had seen right through him. Julian's smile widened. "Oh, don't you worry about that, madame. A chef can always find the right tool when he needs to." He was bluffing, but he would move heaven and earth to get that press here just to see her fail. He stood up straight, crossing his arms over his chest. The entire dining room was watching now. It was a silent theater. "So, what do you say? Are you willing to put your money where your mouth is? Or are you just content to be a quiet critic from the safety of your chair?" Her grandson looked pleadingly at her, begging her with his eyes to just refuse. But the woman looked at Julian with something new in her expression. It wasn't fear or anger. It was a glint of amusement, as if she was a retired chess master being challenged by a loud, arrogant young player who had just made a very, very foolish move. She didn't look at the other diners. She didn't seem to care about the spectacle. She just looked at the chef who had just thrown down the gauntlet. "It has been a long time since I've had a proper kitchen to play in, chef," she said. A tiny, almost mischievous smile finally appeared on her face. "I accept your challenge." The gasp from the grandson was audible. Julian's own smile froze for a fraction of a second. He hadn't expected that. He had expected her to be flustered, to mumble an excuse to retreat. But she had accepted. The public humiliation he had planned for her was now in jeopardy. What if she was just a crazy woman who didn't know what she was getting into? "Excellent," he said, recovering quickly, his confidence returning. "Excellent. It will be an education for everyone." He turned and clapped his hands loudly. The sound made several people jump. The restaurant's manager scurried over. "Julian, is everything all right?" "Everything is wonderful," Julian said, his voice booming with false cheer. "We are going to have a little demonstration tonight. A guest has so graciously offered to show us all how it's done. Get me Antoine. Now, tell him I need the antique press from the collection, and get him to bring it here, immediately." As the manager scurried away, Julian looked back at the woman. "One moment, madame. We must prepare the stage for our star performer." He walked back toward the kitchen, his mind racing. He would send a runner for the press. It would take at least an hour. In the meantime, he would have his staff prepare everything else, but leave the most critical steps for her. He would give her a duck that was slightly off, a pan that wasn't hot enough, some salt that was too coarse. He would stack the deck against her in 100 subtle ways. He would make sure that when she failed spectacularly. He would prove to her and to himself and to his entire world that his way was the only way. As he pushed through the swinging doors back into his sterile, white kingdom, he felt a surge of adrenaline. This was better than a good review. This was a victory. He was about to destroy the one person who had dared to question him. He was the king, and the court jester had just volunteered for her own beheading. He just didn't know that he had invited the queen to come and play his game. The kitchen, usually a place of quiet, tense efficiency, was buzzing with a nervous electric energy. Word of the challenge had spread through the staff like a wildfire. Cooks, who were usually afraid to even make eye contact with Julian, now whispered to each other in hushed, excited tones. A customer, an old woman, was going to cook in Julian's kitchen. It was the most unbelievable thing that had ever happened in the sterile history of Verve. Julian stood in the center of it all, a conductor of a frantic orchestra, his movements sharp and angry. "Get me the Pekin ducks from the walk-in," he barked, "and not the best ones. Give me one of the smaller ones, the ones with a little less fat. I want her to struggle." He pointed at a young pastry chef. "You, go to the dry stores. Get me the coarsest sea salt you can find, not the fine French salt, the cheap stuff, and the oldest black peppercorns." He was setting up a minefield, creating a series of small, almost invisible obstacles that would ensure her failure. While his staff scrambled, Julian paced. He felt a gnawing sense of unease that he couldn't quite shake. Why had she accepted so calmly? Most people would have been flustered, would have backed down. Her quiet confidence was unnerving. He pushed the thought away. She was just a stubborn old woman, too proud to admit she was wrong. He would enjoy crushing that pride. After a tense 45 minutes, the manager returned, his face pale and sweating, followed by two strapping young men carrying a heavy wooden crate. They set it down carefully on the floor with a heavy thud. Julian knelt and pried the lid open. Inside, nestled in velvet cloth, was a magnificent silver duck press. It was an antique, a thing of brutal beauty, with heavy screws and a large tray to catch the juices. It looked less like a piece of kitchen equipment and more like a medieval torture device. A slow, wicked smile spread across Julian's face. This was it. The final piece of his trap was in place. A few minutes later, the swinging doors to the kitchen opened, and the woman walked in. She had taken off her cardigan, revealing just the simple white shirt, which was now protected by a dark blue apron a busboy had given her. Her hands were bare. She looked around the kitchen not with intimidation, but with a quiet, appraising curiosity, like a master carpenter entering another's workshop. She noticed the layout, the quality of the pots hanging from the racks, the tension in the shoulders of the young cooks. "Welcome, Madame," Julian said, his voice thick with saccharine sweetness. "Your stage is ready. Your ingredients are here." He gestured to a small steel table where he had had everything laid out. The smaller-than-a-deal duck, a bowl of the cheap salt, a small plate of aging peppercorns, a bottle of mediocre brandy instead of the fine cognac they used for sauces. He had arranged it all to look casual, but every detail was a calculated insult. The woman walked over to the table. She ran a hand over the duck. Her fingers, which looked soft and almost delicate, pressed gently into the flesh. She picked up a pinch of the salt and rubbed it between her thumb and forefinger. She didn't say a word. She just looked at it, then looked over at Julian. He met her gaze, his own eyes challenging, daring her to complain. But she didn't. She simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and turned her attention to the task. The staff, who had been watching from their stations, now froze, mesmerized. Julian leaned against a counter, arms crossed, a smug expression on his face. He was ready for the show to begin. She started not with the duck, but with her own hands. She went to the industrial sink and began to wash them. But she didn't just use the soap and scrub. She took her time, cleaning under her fingernails, washing her hands up to her wrists with a methodical, almost ritualistic focus. It was the act of a professional, someone who understood that the first step in any great dish is absolute cleanliness. Then she walked to the pot rack. She didn't ask for anything. She simply reached up and took down a heavy-bottomed sautepan. She held it in her hand, feeling its weight, before placing it on the stove. Next, she took down a heavy chef's knife, not one of the new, fancy Japanese-style knives his cooks preferred, but an old, classic German steel one. She tested the edge on her thumb, then took a sharpening steel and with a series of quick, confident strokes, honed the blade to a razor's edge. The shing-shing-shing sound was the only noise in the kitchen. The young cooks watched, captivated. They had all seen Julian use these techniques, but this was different. There was a grace to her movements, an economy of motion that spoke of thousands of hours of practice. She picked up the duck, and then she began to break it down. The young cooks held their breath. They expected her to hesitate, to make clumsy cuts, but she moved with a terrifying, fluid certainty. Her knife was an extension of her arm. She removed the wings, the legs, and the breasts, with a series of swift, precise cuts that separated the joints perfectly, without hacking the bone. She worked with the duck, not as if it were an object, but as if she understood its very anatomy. It was a butchery demonstration that would have made the old French masters proud. A young cook next to Julian whispered, "Where did she learn to do that?" "That's not a culinary school technique. That's old school. Like from a Parisian butcher shop." Julian didn't answer. His smug smile was gone, replaced by a deep frown. He recognized the style. It was the style from the old books, the black and white photos of chefs in high, pleated toques who cooked with fire and instinct, not with immersion circulators and lab chemicals. It was the style he had dismissed as outdated and inefficient. After separating the prime cuts, she took a heavy cleaver and with 2 expert blows chopped the remaining carcass into pieces. She did it with a force that seemed to belie her small frame. The sound echoed in the silent kitchen. She then took the coarse salt Julian had given her, and instead of being daunted, she simply crushed a larger quantity in a mortar and pestle until it was the fineness she needed. She wasn't fooled by his petty tricks. She was adapting. She placed the duck carcass into a stock pot with shallots, thyme, and a bay leaf, and covered it with water to begin the initial stock. She seared the duck breasts, skin side down, in the hot pan she had selected, the fat rendering out beautifully. The kitchen began to fill with an incredible mouth-watering aroma that was simple, pure, and real. It was a smell Julian's kitchen rarely produced. His food smelled of science and innovation. This smelled of home. She turned her attention to the sauce. She took the mediocre brandy Julian had provided. She didn't complain. She simply poured a small amount into the hot pan where the duck had been searing, flambéed it with a match, and let the alcohol burn off, concentrating the flavors. She then added the stock she had started, along with a little red wine vinegar and some of the crushed black pepper. She wasn't following a recipe. She was tasting, adjusting, and building layers of flavor by instinct. The final part of the process was the press. The two men brought the heavy silver press over to her station. She directed them on where to place it. Then, with the help of a nervous-looking sous chef, she loaded the crushed duck carcass into the press. The entire staff gathered around, watching in awe. They had never seen this machine used in person. It was like a museum piece come to life. She began to turn the large wheel on the side of the press. At first, it was easy. But as the pressure increased, the wheel became harder and harder to turn. The muscles in her forearms, which had looked so soft, now stood out like cords. Her face was a mask of concentration. She was using her whole body, her weight, her strength, to turn the wheel. Slowly, a thick, dark, bloody liquid began to ooze from the spout at the bottom, dripping into a waiting pan. The smell was intense, mineral-rich, and primal. Julian watched, his arms now hanging loosely at his sides. He was no longer a king watching a fool. He was a student watching a master. He saw the way she handled the press, the way she anticipated the pressure, the way she knew exactly when to stop. He saw the wisdom in her simple, direct techniques. He saw the heart she had spoken of, being pressed out of the bones and blood of the duck. A heart that his foam and powders could never replicate. The fear and pity in the room had completely dissolved, placed by a profound, dawning respect. The young cooks were watching a legend, even if they didn't know her name. They were seeing food being made not with ego, but with soul. And in that moment, Julian Vance, the arrogant chef who had set out to humiliate a woman, felt a strange and terrifying emotion. He felt small. The floor no longer felt like his kingdom. It felt like her classroom. And he was the student who had just arrived late and with a very bad attitude. The final, thick, dark liquid dripped from the silver press, a steady, rhythmic plink-plink-plinked into the waiting saucepan. The sound was the only one that mattered in the kitchen. It was the heartbeat of the dish. The woman, her face beaded with a light sheen of sweat from the effort of turning the press, gave the wheel one last firm turn. A final, richer gush of dark red essence flowed out, and then it was done. The silence in the room was so thick it felt like a physical presence. With a quiet thank you to the sous chef who had helped steady the press, she returned to her station. Her movements were still graceful, unhurried. She didn't preen or look for approval. Her focus was entirely on the pan in front of her. The carcass in the press was now a dry, crushed memory. What remained was the soul of the duck, captured in liquid form. She strained the rich stock she had made earlier into the pan with the pressed juices. Her hands steady as she held the chinois, a fine mushhead sieve. She didn't rush. She let the liquid flow through at its own pace, ensuring only the purest, clearest sauce remained, while the sauce began to reduce. A process she controlled with the focus of a bomb disposal expert. She turned her attention back to the duck breasts she had seared. They were resting on a cutting board, the skin a perfect, crispy, golden brown. Using the tip of her knife, she tested the firmness. Satisfied, she began to slice. Again, it was a master class in precision. Each slice was exactly the same thickness, with a delicate, almost translucent edge of cooked flesh surrounding a perfect, rosy pink center. The way she held the knife, the angle of her wrist, the confident, unhurried pressure it, was all a performance of a life spent holding a blade, as she arranged the slices on a plain white service plate, not one of the abstract, asymmetrical plates Julian preferred. The young cooks watched as if hypnotized. They weren't just seeing a recipe being executed. They were watching a philosophy being demonstrated. They were learning more in these 20 minutes than they had in months of working under Julian's regime of fear and perfection. They were seeing that cooking wasn't about winning awards or impressing critics. It was about respect. Respect for the animal, for the ingredients, for the tradition, and for the person who would eventually eat the food. Julian was rooted to the spot where he stood. He was no longer leaning against the counter in a pose of casual superiority. He was standing stiffly, his arms hanging at his sides, his hands clenched into loose fists. His mind was racing, trying to process what he was seeing. The movements were so familiar, yet so foreign at the same time. He felt a strange pull of memory of black and white books he had studied as a young, ambitious apprentice. Books about the mothers of French cuisine, formidable women who had run the Grand Paris restaurants before the era of the male celebrity chef. He saw the woman finish plating. She arranged the sliced duck in a gentle fan. She took a spoon and skimmed the last of the fat from the surface of her sauce. She tasted it one last time. Her eyes closed for a second, a flicker of contentment on her face. She didn't add anything else. No foam, no gel, no powder, no microgreens. The dish was complete. It was just duck and sauce, presented with an honest simplicity that was more powerful than any of Julian's complex creations. It was the truth. She picked up the plate. For the first time since she had entered the kitchen, she looked directly at Julian. Her expression was unreadable. There was no triumph in her eyes. No, I told you so. It was a neutral, almost empty look, but it held a power that made Julian's throat feel tight. A dish should be tasted by its maker before it is served, she said, her voice soft but clear in the silent room. But there is only enough for the guest. She held the plate out to him, not as an offering, but as a statement. You are the host. It is your restaurant. You should be the first to judge. This was a moment that could have gone many ways. He could have refused. He could have said it was for the customer and sent it out. He could have had one of his line cooks taste it first, a final act of defensiveness. But he didn't. He was trapped by her directness, by the unspoken challenge in her simple gesture. He had set a trap for her, but she had just turned it into a test of his own character. Slowly, Julian walked toward her. The staff parted for him as if he were walking through water. He took the plate from her hands. It felt heavier than it should have, weighted with history and expectation. He took a small fork from a nearby tray. His hand was not quite steady. He took a slice of the duck, dipped it slightly into the glistening dark sauce, put it in his mouth. The flavor hit him like a physical blow. It was not the sharp, surprising taste he was used to creating. It was a deep, rolling wave of flavor that seemed to fill every part of his senses. There was the richness of the duck, the crispiness of the skin, but it was the sauce that was the revelation. It was profound. It tasted of the bird, of the bone, of the blood, of the fire it was cooked over. It was savory and complex, with a depth that seemed almost impossible. It was a flavor that told a story of a life lived and a death honored. It was, he realized with a sickening lurch in his stomach, everything he had ever aspired to create and had so spectacularly failed to do. His food was clever. This was real. He swallowed hard. The kitchen was still silent. He could feel the eyes of his entire staff on him, waiting for a reaction. He couldn't speak. Words felt useless, hollow. He looked at the woman, and in his eyes, she could see the crumbling of his fortress. She saw the shock, the dawning horror of a man who had just seen the truth about himself. The quiet was broken by a soft click. A young cook, one of the sauce station workers, had quietly pulled up an old culinary article on a tablet computer he often used for recipes. He had been searching for the old butchery techniques he had just witnessed. He found it. He tilted the screen toward Julian, his hand shaking slightly. It was a photo from the 1980s. It showed a much younger version of the woman standing in his kitchen. Standing proudly in front of a restaurant, her arms crossed, a confident smile on her face. Below the photo was a headline that made Julian's blood run cold. It read, "Elodie Blanchard, Lemire Blanchard, the godmother of gastronomy, retires after 3 decades of 3-star excellence." Elodie Blanchard. The name echoed in the cavernous space of his memory. He had heard it, of course. All serious chefs had. She was a legend, a ghost story told in old culinary schools. She was the chef who had trained half the famous chefs in France. The one who had walked away from the Michelin Guide at the height of her power because she said the ratings were killing the soul of food. She was the old guard, personified. The master of the craft he had built his career by rejecting. He looked from the glowing screen of the tablet to the unassuming woman, who was now calmly wiping down her station with a cloth, as if she had just finished a casual cooking class at a community center. He hadn't just challenged a random customer. He had publicly challenged one of the greatest chefs of the century. He hadn't set a trap for a fool. He had invited a queen into his kingdom and tried to make a jester of her. The arrogance of it, the sheer staggering ignorance washed over him. The king wasn't just a fool. He was a clown. A humbled, pathetic clown. He looked down at the plate in his hand, at the masterpiece he had just tasted. The last bite of duck in his mouth suddenly tasted like ash. It was the taste of his own foolishness. The silence that followed was heavier than anything Julian had ever experienced. It wasn't the silence of waiting. It was the silence of judgment, a verdict that had been passed without a single word being spoken. The tablet with the black and white photo had been quietly lowered, but its image was now seared into the mind of every person in the room. They weren't just looking at an old woman anymore. They were in the presence of a living legend, and they had just witnessed their leader. Their tyrant try to humiliate her on her own turf. Julian stood frozen, the plate in his hand feeling like it was made of lead. He couldn't meet her eyes, couldn't meet the eyes of his staff, could only stare at the half-eaten piece of duck on the plate, a symbol of his monumental arrogance. The kitchen, his sterile, perfect kingdom, now felt like a cage, and he was the most pathetic creature in it. Madame Blanchard finished wiping down the steel counter where she had worked. She left it spotless, cleaner than it had been before she started. She placed the cloth neatly by the sink, her movements unhurried, as if the entire drama of the last hour had been a minor, unimportant distraction. She turned to face him. Her face was not triumphant. There was no glint of "I told you so" in her eyes. If anything, she looked tired and a little sad. It was the expression of a teacher who was disappointed in a promising but misguided student. She took a step toward him. The young cooks instinctively took a step back, creating a circle around them, a private arena for the final act of this silent battle. "Passion without respect is just noise, Chef Julian," she said. Her voice was still, soft, but it carried the weight of experience. The gentle but firm authority of someone who had earned the right to speak the truth. She was not looking down on him. She was looking at him, trying to make him see. "You have a great gift," she continued, gesturing vaguely around the kitchen. "Your hands are skilled. Your mind is sharp. You have built something beautiful here." She paused, letting the compliment hang in the air, a strange kindness after the verbal beating he deserved. "But your food is clever. It is not yet wise. It is a beautiful room with no furniture. It is a story with a stunning beginning but no heart. You have forgotten that the purpose of all this is not to show the world how smart you are, but to nourish them, to give them comfort, to give them a memory. You cannot do that if you do not first understand the ingredients, not just as things to be manipulated, but as life that has been given for your table." She looked down at her own hands. "We take their traditions, their hard-won knowledge, and we add our own voice to the song. You have been trying to sing a new song by ignoring all the old ones. It will always be a lonely song." She reached out and gently tapped the silver duck press, which still sat on the table. "This machine is not a relic. It is a promise. It is a promise to use every part of the animal to honor its sacrifice, to extract every drop of flavor and soul. That is the heart of cooking. Not a powder, not a foam. With that, she gave a small, sad smile and a slight nod. Not just to him, but to the entire staff. She had delivered her lesson. There was nothing more to say. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the swinging doors. The staff, as if waking from a trance, parted to let her through. They watched in silence as she disappeared back into the dining room, returning to her grandson and her meal. As if she had just stepped away for a moment to check on the weather. The doors swung shut behind her, leaving Julian alone with his staff, his shame, and the ghost of the flavor still on his tongue. For a long time, no one moved. The young cooks looked at each other, their faces a mixture of awe, confusion, and pity for their chef. The power dynamic in the room had been permanently shattered. The fear that had been the foundation of their work was gone, replaced by a new, unsettling truth. They realized their leader wasn't a god, but a man who had lost his way. The tyranny was over, but they had no idea what would come next. Julian finally moved. He walked slowly to the pass, the flat ledge where finished dishes were picked up by the waiters. He placed the plate with the remaining half of the duck down onto the cool stainless steel. He looked at it for a moment, a perfect, elegant, and humbling testament to his own ignorance. Then he did something that surprised everyone. He didn't smash the plate. He didn't throw something. He didn't yell. He simply walked to the dish pit, the area where dirty pans and plates were sent to be scrubbed. He picked up a long-handled, coarse-bristled brush, a tool he hadn't touched since he was a teenage apprentice. He walked back to the station where Madame Blanchard had worked, knelt down, and began to scrub the floor around the silver press. He scrubbed with a desperate, focused energy, was scrubbing away the spilled duck blood, the tiny scraps of vegetable, the physical evidence of her presence. But he knew he was also trying to scrub away the shame, the humiliation, the crushing weight of his own ego. His staff watched in stunned silence as their Michelin-starred chef, the man who once fired a cook for using a slightly dull knife, scrubbed the floor on his hands and knees. When the floor was clean, he stood up. He didn't look at anyone. He just picked up the heavy silver press, his arms straining with the effort. He carried it over to a storage closet, a place where old, unused equipment was kept. He placed it inside gently, almost reverently, and shut the door. He walked back to the center of the kitchen. His staff was still watching, waiting. He looked at their faces, at the fear and the confusion and the newfound respect for a woman they had never heard of an hour ago. He took a deep breath. It was the first time he had truly breathed all night. "The restaurant is closed for the rest of the service," he said. His voice was quiet, raw. "Clear down your stations. Clean everything. Everything." The young cooks hesitated for a second, then sprang into action. But it was a different kind of action. There was no tension, no fear. There was a quiet, shared purpose. They worked together, helping each other, talking in low, amazed voices about what they had just seen. Julian walked over to the young sauce cook, who had found the article. "What is her full name?" he asked. "Elodie Blanchard, chef," the cook said, his voice still full of awe. "Find everything you can," Julian said. "Every article, every interview, every old recipe. I want to know everything about her and her restaurant, Lemire Blanchard." That night, long after the staff had gone home, Julian sat alone in his office, the glow of a computer screen illuminating his face. He read article after article. He saw photos of her bustling, warm-looking Parisian restaurant, so different from his own minimalist temple. He read her old philosophies, her disdain for cooking for critics, and her belief that a chef's primary duty was to the customer's soul. He saw the names of the famous chefs who had trained in her kitchen, men and women who now ran their own global empires. He realized that the entire modern culinary world, including his own small corner of it, was built on the foundation that people like her had laid. He wasn't a rebel. He was an ungrateful child, throwing a tantrum in the house his parents had built. The next morning, the staff arrived for prep, nervous about what they would find. The kitchen was already there, but it was different. The lights seemed a little warmer. The silence was less tense, more peaceful. And Julian was there, standing at a cutting board. He wasn't barking orders. He wasn't critiquing. He was simply making a stock. He had a chicken, some carrots, onions, and celery. He was cutting them. Not with the frantic geometric precision he usually demanded, but with a simple, rustic chop. He was building a flavor base from scratch, with his own hands. He was starting over. He looked up as his staff filed in. He didn't smile, but he didn't scowl. He just nodded. "Today," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "we are going to learn how to make a proper stock. And then we are going to make a soup. A very simple soup. No powders, no foams, just vegetables and water and time." The young cooks looked at each other, a slow smile spreading on their faces. The king was no longer on his throne. He was standing with them, a student in his own kitchen. The arrogant chef had been humbled, and in his place a true cook was finally ready to begin.